Welcome to Virtual Insights. Antoine Sargent in conversation with Horace D. Ballard. Thank you again for joining us today. My name's Persephone Allen, and I'm the manager of adult public programs at the American Folk Art Museum in New York City. As many of you know, our museum is dedicated to expanding the appreciation and understanding of self-taught art across time and place. And we're thrilled to celebrate 6 decades of this work with our institution's 60th anniversary this year. We are grateful for opportunities like this to connect online, which would not be possible without your support. Thank you for donating to sustain ongoing virtual experiences like this one, our 60th milestone, and all of the events we've organized this year. As we tune in from our homes today, we want to begin by acknowledging that our museum stands upon the unceded traditional homeland of the Lenape Delaware peoples, and we honor members of this nation, past, present, and future. This afternoon's conversation is being recorded and will be published online at a later date. Closed captioning in English can be activated by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. We'll begin today by introducing Antoine and Horace, who will share their thoughts on our current exhibition and their own work before we close today with Q&A. We invite you to share questions for our speakers throughout the program using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And we'll make every effort to respond to as many of these as possible at the end of the discussion. Today, we explore questions of representation and expansive approaches to photography, looking closely at our current exhibition, Photo Brut, Collection Bruno Descharmes and Company, and taking the genre of portrait photography as the genesis for a broader conversation on more diverse photo histories and contemporary practices, centering works by artists of African descent in particular. We are honored to be joined by inimitable curators Antoine Sargent and Horace D. Ballard, who we've invited to respond both to our exhibition and to introduce us to their own projects, which similarly chart new territory for more inclusive approaches to photography. Our current exhibition, and we can go to the next slide, please. Photo Brut opened earlier this year in January and is on view at our galleries in Manhattan until early June. This show is curated by my wonderful colleague and our senior curator, Valerie Russo, with collector and filmmaker Bruno Descharmes in collaboration with Barbara Safarova, Sam Stordze, and Paula Eisenberg. The exhibition brings together more than 400 works by 40 self-taught artists that present radically different ways of seeing and being seen, and encompass a wide range of works from traditional photographs to collages, photo montages, and slides of film never developed. Drawing from this incredible range, we've selected images by 3 artists, Elizabeth Van Vive, Steve Ashby, and an unidentified 20th century artist whose approaches to photography exemplify the diverse processes and multiplicity of perspectives on display in this show. But before we take a closer look at these works, it's really my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Antoine Sargent is a writer, critic, and director at Gagosian Gallery, living and working in New York City. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, W, Vogue, and other publications. He has contributed to essays in museums and gallery publications on Ed Clark, McLean Thomas, Arthur Jaffa, Deborah Roberts, and Yinka Shonibare, among other artists. He has lectured and participated in public conversations with artists at the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Brooklyn Museum, MCA Denver, the Art Gallery of Ontario, Harvard University, and Yale University. He has also co-organized a number of exhibitions, including The Way We Live Now at Aperture, Then and Now, Chase Hall and Cameron Welch at Jenkins Johnson's Projects, and the traveling exhibition, Young, Gifted, and Black. The New Black Vanguard, Photography Between Art and Fashion is his first book, and we are so excited that he'll be speaking about that today. Dr. Horace Ballard is curator of American art at the Williams College Museum of Art. He is a lecturer on 18th, 19th, and 20th century portraiture, the visual cultures of race and gender, and the material cultures of religion in the joint graduate program for the history of art at the Clark Art Institute and Williams College. He has held positions in the curatorial, education, and interpretation departments at the Yale University Art Gallery, the RISD Museum of Art, Monticello, the home of Thomas Jefferson, and the Birmingham Museum of Art. His recent exhibitions include monographic presentations of the photographs of Barbara Morgan and James Van Der Zee, Possible Selves, Queer Photo Vernaculars, Landmarks, a 180-year history of landscape and photography, and Shift, new interpretations in American and European art, which he collaborated on with curatorial colleagues. He is currently working on the 2022 posthumous survey for the 20th century sculptor Marianne Unger, and in 2023, The Emancipation Project, a dynamic investigation of monuments and race, an emancipatory practice that spans the 19th and 21st centuries. We're so honored and thrilled to be joined by you both today and to share this virtual space. Thank you again. And I'd like to invite you to begin our conversation today by reflecting on works by Elizabeth Van Vive. So I think we'll move to our next slide, please. And Horace, might you start us off today?
Of course. Thank you, Persephone, and to the American Folk Art Museum for gathering us in this space. Thank you for all of you, no matter where you are physically, for holding space with us. And it's my deep honor and privilege to be in conversation with Antoine, whose work I have long admired. Elizabeth Van Vive's portraits, I would call them, are these incredible compositions that immediately caught my eye as I thought about this exhibition. And I think that they both affirm and trouble so many of the conceits that we think of: folk, portrait, and what it means to be taught or self-taught when it comes to photographic processes. There's also just a kind of sonics in her work that I find really interesting. And I'm wondering if Antoine, in his great expertise, might also find it interesting to riff on that. You know, she's shot so many of her images, if not all of them, that are in the exhibition on disposable film, coming out of the late 60s, early 70s, these little cameras that so many of us born in the 20th century know so well. And one of the things we don't often talk about, but is inherently true, is that that film is already pressured and impinged. It's already calibrated at the high contrast of the film spectrum, right? It's almost as if it already assumes you're taking this in a dark space with just the light of candles, so it's already assuming a chiaroscuro, or you're taking it because you're on vacation somewhere and the sun is beaming down. And all of that heightened, suffuse color is here. And that, in the work of folks like Fred Moten and Tina Kemp, but also to our own eye, gives it a kind of sonics, a kind of frisson, a kind of percolation that bleeds across sensations. And I just think her work is so generous and so beautiful, these pathways that open. And I'm wondering, Antoine, if you see any of that, and also just what strikes you to your eye.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for having us in conversation. One of the things that, I was particularly struck by is, again, as you touch on, Horace, is this notion of the self-taught. What does that mean in relationship to photography, right? A medium that, Frederick Douglass sort of defined as a democratic medium, right? With a democratic potential, right? And so I think that when I'm thinking about sort of, image makers or photographers who simply picked up a camera, right? I often sort of think about sort of the history for me of sort of Black portraiture, right? And sort of thinking about how cameras, as a sort of technology that is about sort of, as technology sort of advanced, cameras got better, right? And, as we get to sort of the 1920s, if you will, you have this Brownie camera, right? You're sort of talking, and the possibilities of self-imaging sort of explode around that time, right? And so you have all of these different photographers, self-taught, sort of having the opportunity to sort of image what they wanted to be seen, right? Things that they wanted to show that was of value, of note, the mundane, the everyday. And I think you see this in her work. I think you see this sort of, if you can move to the next slide. You sort of see this in sort of the quotidian, right? These are moments that that are perhaps could be described as small moments, but she saw, right, and felt as though they should be recorded, right? And so I'm sort of interested in in this particular work in the ways in which she's sort of recording the everyday and from her perspective, right? Because for certain, I mean, as I think about sort of the history of photography and as I've been sort of engaging in this work through sort of the photo product, the photo exhibition and book that I did, I'm always thinking about how different artists have come to sort of see the world, and then how are they sort of communicating that world through the images that they took, right? And I think that you don't really what's so sort of I think also interesting about her work is that there's this sort of mysteriousness to it, right? Like you don't really sort of know exactly why, but there's this sort of real care, right? There's this real sort of construction in the arrangement of the objects, right? That, for example, in this Untitled work, this Frank Sinatra looks like a record. It's sort of delicately placed, and I think that like I'm always thinking about the way that artists are thinking through sort of the construction of their images. What do they want to communicate, right? And I always like to use the word image maker because it implies that that there is some distance between sort of the image that sort of we all come to sort of see on museum walls or in galleries or on Instagram or in homes, and the artist who made it, right? It's not just sort of a simple state of fact, right? And I think that for me, to have, these possible moves in a photograph, it's just a really sort of interesting to sort of, again, think through why, right? And what that might say about not our world, but her world, right? And sort of the space in which she's creating from.
I love that. And if we could go to the next image, please. I think this only kind of confirms and walks alongside so much that you said. And I love that idea, if I can just go back, that idea of the democratization of the photograph and the democratization of a medium and a moment. And what I've often found is that, and I think that Van Vaey's work does this, is that photography not only opened up who got to picture their world, but it also radically impinged upon what was acceptable to be pictured, just as you defined it. And there's something here that I think that we often ascribe to a kind of late 1970s, 1980s, once the great works of semiotics and deconstruction get translated into English and then kind of through two generations of academics filtered down to students, no matter what those students are studying. But what we're also seeing is a sense of the archive and a sense of trace and a sense of the eye hungry for some desire in a future moment to go back and do the kind of Rolodex, the collating, the understanding of the sensorium of a life that one can hold in hand. And I think there's something so, just human and authentic about that comes through in these works, and so many works in the show, but definitely her works too.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that is also sort of interesting, particularly, about her work is, not only the sort of, it's all sort of object based, right? So it's like you're getting these sort of objects, but it's funny, it's playful. You're here, you have sort of this record on the couch, and it's as if the figure is sort of laying on this couch, right? And I think that I'm often sort of particularly Elizabeth had, developmental delays, right? And sort of used the camera as a way to communicate, right? As a way to sort of speak to the world, right? And I think that, and thinking about that and thinking about sort of who gets to sort of author an image, most of the images that we deal with, sort of say in the popular imagination, textbooks, in magazines, on museum walls, are authored by men, right? And so like to sort of have this moment, where you have someone, one, a woman, two, someone who has developmental delays, sort of having an opportunity to sort of speak about the world in the way they see it, I think is also something that is not lost on me in these images. Because, we are sort of engaged in sort of debates around sort of, again, all of these questions that you were talking about, who gets to be seen? How do they get to be seen? Why did they get to be seen? What do they want? How, like, what do they want folks to see, right? And I think that, like, with particularly with, this work, that there's something sort of profound about the camera being used as, a speech act, if you will, and I just wanted to sort of point that out, because there's, like the artist's narrative, her own personal life, sort of plays, obviously a role in what we're seeing and why we're seeing, and sort of her trying to communicate with the world through photography.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I can't help to return to that kind of in the very first sentence, and thinking about the self-taught nature. Like, what does that mean to be self-taught, right? Particularly all of us who are gifted with sight in a post-war advertisement hyper-visual moment, have a kind of deep intuitive intelligence about framing. I would argue. And when I look at particularly this image that's on the screen, right, it is frame within frame within frame, right? It's almost as if she took color theory classes. That sense of that body extending and sliding down on the couch only amplifies the sense that that body is already framed and cropped for an advertisement, for a very particular purpose, to sell to someone. And what is that gaze on that body, and how is her gaze redoubling, and then our gaze is magnifying through the aperture. There's something so precarious about the photograph as object intuitively anyway, particularly when we think about the analog photograph and film and all of the complexities about when a thing is quote unquote printed. But then to have someone in all of her varied neuro capacity to still be playing with compositional elements, it's so, I mean, it's cool and it's liberatory, and it does help us, I think, rethink, just as you were saying, the sense of the author and the sense of the ways in which, even before we make, we are already conditioned to see a certain way, even across the spectrum of capacity and intuition. And that's, I mean, it's revelatory, and it's in that way.
I also think that because she was using disposable cameras, right? So these are sort of, in a way, snapshots, right? And they're sort of obsessive, right? There were some 30,000 images, it was said, that she took, right? And so she was, and so I also like to think about these as like sort of cataloging, sort of a tense sort of cataloging of the world in which how she encountered it, right, on her terms, right? And obviously she had a great affinity for music, right? And listening to music and bringing, all of those sort of desperate sort of aspects of her life into the frame, right? And you talked about sort of a framing on framing on framing, which I think is a really sort of useful way to sort of think about the constructing of a photograph, right? So you have the frame that you have, you know, sort of inevitably grew up with, right? And so that's one sort of framing, and then you're sort of using that to sort of then frame the world, right? I think there's one other image that that is a part of this set of images. Oh, are we not? Okay. Should we keep moving?
I hate to, I feel like we could all just listen. Yes, we could spend the next hour just listening to your thoughts. But let's look at another work. We can move to Steve Ashby. And this is just, I think I've looked at these works over the last few months while we've had the exhibition, and you're just helping us to see them in such nuanced and thoughtful and new ways.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I mean, it's also this notion of like, I'm sort of caught on sort of the notion of the self-taught, just given like the ways in which, you know, photographs have had, particularly for, you know, sort of in sort of the history or the Black tradition, if you will, like, you know, those, you know, we didn't for a very long time have very few paintings of Black people, right? So when sort of the explosion of photography sort of happens, you get sort of all of these possible sort of representations that are then controlled or authored by sort of the neighborhood, you know, cameraman, your grandmother. I know in my family, my mother was like a just for tedious like photo, you know, like the thing that we did, and we kept them in these photo albums. And I'm thinking about sort of, you know, the vernacular in this, right? I'm thinking about sort of the ways in which that like that there's always this sort of rootedness in sort of a particular community or a particular experience, and how those images, you know, very often it wasn't really said, at least in my childhood, that they were actually trying to offset something, right? They're sort of trying to sort of respond to a larger image culture where you might not see yourself, right? And so I think about sort of the ways in which, like, you know, my grandmother, my mother, you sort of walk into, you know, their living rooms, and you have these like perfectly framed photographs that were sort of taken by a self-taught photographer, and how they were just so much care and sort of the, you know, fake gold frames they put them in, and it serves a communication, you know, communicating, sorry, a personal history, right? The family's personal history, the aspects of, you know, beauty and being and identity that matters in sort of that living room, right? Or matters sort of in a way that it might be disregarded outside of sort of that sort of private public space, you know? And so I'm always sort of thinking about that in relationship to like being self-taught, but also in relationship to sort of like images being published, right? And sort of the kinds of images that that are said to sort of represent certain people, you know, and so whenever I sort of encounter a quote unquote self-taught photographer, I'm always thinking about sort of what perspective are they trying to communicate through their work, right? And why? You know, like what is the why behind you know, this particular work, you know? And I mean, not to sort of like go on a tangent, but I'm always sort of just, I find that to be just sort of almost more fascinating than the actual image that I'm seeing in a way, because of that sort of, you know, again, construction aspect, right? The sort of framing, the deliberation around sort of what is included in the image and what's left out, right? And because there's a, you know, even in the sort of last images that we were looking at, there's a lot left out of those, you know, of those images, right? And so I think that like I'm always looking at a photographer's framing as an invitation to see how they want us to see.
That's so beautiful, and I think that ideas of construction, ideas of kind of that sitting room, that living room as a site of beauty, as a site of kind of an endemic, inherent practice toward calling in, becoming, that idea of really having the photographer center their world, their construction, what they want to remember, what they want to share, you know, in an interesting way. And kind of Ashby's assemblages,
Mm-hmm.
that's here too.
Right.
And we have these kind of what in my world I think about as kind of bust portraits placed upon these three-dimensional embodied forms, right? And so here we have someone who either pulling through Essence, Jet, Vogue, pulling through that family scrapbook. At a certain point, that's not enough. These things need to be embodied. These things need to be felt, not just with the eyes and a kind of longing or excitement, but now they need to be tactile. Now they need to, and in some way, in that way in which every time we look at a photograph, I remember Titus Kaphar saying this once in his talk, that like every time you look at a photograph, every time you paint, every time you repurpose a memory, call it to attention, it changes. And here in Ashby's work, after the passing of his wife, he's just like, it's not enough for the photograph just to remember. It needs to become a new thing. I need to repurpose and make a new construction. And so kind of the applique of lace at the bottom and the kind of portrait bust head is in piece with this fabricated construction of found assemblaged objects that now give us, you know, Black life in 3 dimensions, you know, and there's something, I mean, there's something kind of uncanny. And I can imagine that you don't want to like walk in if he invites you in for like a bourbon and turn the corner quickly in the dark and see these things. But seeing them, thinking about them living, it only draws me back to that living room moment. It only makes me long to go, oh, I bet there was laughter, and I bet there were dirty jokes, and I bet there was love, and I bet that there was, again, a kind of sonics and surround of the body moving. And there's something that's there too, isn't it, in the Black tradition, particularly in the South, particularly in the West Coast. We have these traditions of the found photograph coming in with the found object and assemblage in these industrial moments to create new, sometimes monumental spaces.
Yeah, I mean, what's sort of interesting, you know, about Ashby is that, you know, he's descendant from, you know, enslaved people, right? His father and I'm always, I mean, I read this quote that he said, and I'm just paraphrasing, but he's, you know, he said something about like waking up with an idea and he couldn't go back to sleep. And so he had to he had to make that idea, right? And so it's this idea of construction, but also, you know, in other images that he makes, you know, there are images of animals, right? And sort of that takes us back to sort of the evoke, you know, sort of Virginia, where his family sort of lived and were enslaved. And, you know, and so I think that you have, again, this, you know, aspect of like construction, but also playing with, you know, sort of histories and identities and how do you construct them into, you know, these assemblages, right? And in some of the works as well, they moved, right? And they did things, right? They were, you know, from having sex to sort of, you know, to other things as well. And so there was a real sort of, I think there was a real sort of use of the image as a way to sort of animate life, right? In a way that sort of goes beyond the two-dimensional, sort of into the three-dimensional, right? And so there was this dimensionality to you know, to sort of an aspect of the photograph that is then used in this other way, right? Because we often sort of have these sort of flat perspectives, right? So what does it mean when a photograph moves, right? Like in sort of can activate a space, right? And how does that movement then change our relationship to the thing that we're seeing, right? And so I think that that sort of like the sort of in a way, it's no longer conceptual. It's actually like, sort of literally doing something in space in a way that, like, I think extends the life of a photograph, right? Or extends the life of that sort of printed media.
I love that. I love that. And that sense of that extension, that incredible kinetic kind of epistemology, that frame within a frame, that frame of our attention. What happens when a photograph moves, right? When it's restless, when it's not content to remain on the page, but comes back again. That memory kind of comes back again in multiple dimensionalities and encountering a life. And if we could go to the next slide, please. I'm just thinking about these assembled things, and also thinking about film, right, in a way, and not, film and Aspie's assemblages, not a one-on-one, and I'm not trying to force a correlation, but there is something interesting about these photographs moving, right? They are moving images. He called them kind of working ups, fixing ups, and that sense of giving animation and making animate and making a little bit new again, because the encounter with these things is not here, it's here. And that shifts our orientation, both of the gaze and of our own preoccupations of space. There's something really cool about that. And something really, I wouldn't necessarily say radical, but something that I do find also, as you were saying, Antoine, in the Black tradition, of just this kind of soteriology that's just, it's a bit of a spiral. It keeps you moving. It keeps you ready. Nothing is complacent. Nothing is just sitting on a shelf. Everything's doing work. And there's something really beautiful about that notion, about that forcefulness to make it new again.
Yeah, I mean, I think this notion of to make it new again, right? These are found photographs, right? That, as you said, ebony jet, but also from films, right, of the 50s and the 60s and 70s, right? And so it's sort of interesting to see that, like, he sees these images sort of in their original context and then makes them do something else, right? And and it just, I think about a lot of different artists who are sort of, particularly Black artists, who are engaged in the act of collage, right? And sort of the bringing together of different histories and identities to make them do something else, or make a new history, or make a new identity. And so it's really an interesting sort of comment, I think, on sort of the middle century, right? And how, not to sort of, try to speak for the artist, but I do sort of think about sort of, Virginia being a site, thinking about the sort of materiality, the way to use wood, and the way that, but he was also sort of, using these sort of representations that, from certain magazines that were meant to be positive, right? And then so from certain films that were, about comedy, but also about sex and about sort of sexiness, and so I think there's a real sort of like playfulness in these works that that I just wanted to sort of comment on, because often, when we think about representation, we think about it as a serious thing, and we're thinking about it sort of like as as an opportunity sort of just for uplift, right? And not sort of an opportunity for other things as well, like just playfulness, or a reaction to sort of certain films, of that period, right? That showed Black people in a certain style, in a certain way that wasn't necessarily reflective of, obviously all of life. And so it's sort of, I'm sort of super interested in the way that he's sort of redeploying the photograph, and redeploying the photograph after it's already had a first life, right? And so there's this sort of afterlife or second life that are sort of in the construction of these works. Is there another image? I want to say, I want to sort of, I love that we included sort of an unidentified artist in this, right? Because I think that I was walking, when the National Museum of African American History and Culture opened, I was walking through the museum and I was just so struck by so much, there's so much artwork there, or so much, you know, sort of creativity that is unidentified. You know, like you just don't know sort of the story or the history of the artist. And so all you have is the work really to sort of guide you, right? And sort of that sort of feeling, right? Which is obviously connected to histories of erasure, right? Or histories of certain artistic expression from certain people being undervalued. And so, but I'm always just sort of so fascinated by whenever I see an unidentified artist or an unidentified work in a museum or in a gallery space, I'm always just like, you know, I'm just so animated by that story, because it really sort of also gets to the heart of a lot of sort of the erasure that has happened, right? And that we are still, in my sort of opinion, not dealing with fully, right? And so to have this work in the exhibition is sort of a reminder, right, of other histories unknown, of other, you know, sort of artists who created that we could not archive, right, that we could not sort of keep in history, you know, that we do not have memory of.
These works by this particular unidentified artist, I must confess, Antoine, I am just so excited to hear you speak on thinking about your own deep engagement in relationship to the fashion world, fashion photography, how we think about fashion, how fashion can be used and employed and leveraged and amplified. And I'm also deeply interested in these works for many of the same reasons that you just gave us, because for me, what I see is a deep employment of the ways in which desire causes and is contractualized to motivate us toward a kind of purchase or into a kind of futurity or into a kind of envisioning of the self. And in that ways, I think desire and fashion do interesting kind of coeval work. But of course, in my role in museums, whenever I walk in and see unidentified on a thing, I'm also thinking about desire, but it's a bit more bleak. It's very much like someone desired it and they took it, or someone desired it and their desire for it was so exceptional or excessive that they did not do the research. Or that it's still unidentified here, but there is a part of the world in which we could get more clarity. Why has this object been in a collection 80, 90, 100 years? And we haven't done that work. We haven't taken to cite it, right? And so this work, particularly in this moment, where museums, particularly in the Americas, are wrestling to have an unidentified artist, reminds me that sometimes artists want to be anonymous or unidentified. And most of the time, it's that curators haven't done that work for any number of reasons. And I know that was a lot, but I do feel like at both ends of that identifiedness, someone moved in desire and did not then go back and do the work.
Well, yeah, no, I think that's a really important. I think that's really important, especially this desire piece. Can we go to the next slide? Oh, go back. Sorry. I wanted to sort of, I think it's a good interlude actually to sort of the New Black Vanguard. Is this, I mean, I was sort of really sort of fascinated, right, with the sort of like desire, fashion, beauty that just gets ignored and that's like in plain sight, right? And so I think that like when you think about sort of histories of dress, when it's particularly pertaining to sort of Black histories of dress, you know, like we have forever, you know, like been engaged in sort of that kind of creativity, right? But doesn't show up in the magazines, right? Until relatively recently. You have someone like James Van Der Zee, right? Who was barred from making, you know, fashion images that sort of for magazines, right? Because of the color of his skin. You have, and then you have this other thing that happens, right? Where you might get sort of an engagement, right? So you might get sort of Van Der Zee spoke about as a sort of art historically, right? And sort of in that mode, but you don't sort of get the other engagement, which is about dress and desire and style, right? And so you get sort of, and so, but then that also happens, I think, again, throughout throughout the 20th century, particularly if you think about Malik Sidibe, and if you think about sort of James Benar, and if you think about sort of, you know, a list of other photographers where it's like, you know, fashion was like a sort of dirty word or something, and it was somehow used to sort of if you spoke about it, or if you did sort of scholarship around it, that work of that artist was less valuable, you know? And so you sort of thought about other sort of aspects that, maybe that played better in the academy, you know, or played better in a museum, that then sort of erases, you know, things that you see right in front of you, you know?
Even someone, forgive me, I'm just, as you were
Yeah,
speaking, I'm just thinking, even someone like Gordon Parks, right?
exactly.
Who's
Yeah,
making one set of images for Time, one
yeah,
set of images for Life. The portfolios up until 5 years ago never talked about that. And then you look and you go, oh my God, almost every iconic image for Life magazine, you know, of a Charles James dress shot in Newport, all Gordon Parks.
yes, exactly. Or then to even sort of continue on with that, right? So Gordon Parks, you know, as we now know, started as a fashion photographer, right? Like that is that's the origin story of one of the great photographers of the 20th century, right? Most of his images still are uncredited to him, particularly ones he shot for Vogue and others, because there's not been the scholarship around that, right? But also because they sort of fall outside of the Gordon Parks that we have come to know, the chronicler of Black life of the 20th century. Those images are mostly images of white women, because at the time, those were the people who were in magazines, right? And so when I sort of think about this, I'm always like, how do you, you know, again, like not erase part of someone's legacy, but allow for the complications of that, right? Or just the breadth and depth of what the man did, to sort of be a part of the whole understanding of what we understand what his images to be, right? And so you have him, you know, in Minnesota and all these other places, sort of like honing his skill through
Yeah.
fashion photography, right? And
Yes.
so I think about that, and I think this is a, you know, a really great sort of, I think this is a really great segue to sort of me to sort of talking briefly about the New Black Van, because I want to get to some of the questions, but you know, we can go to the next slide. So the New Black Vanguard, for those who don't know, is a project that is sort of ongoing. It started with Aperture Foundation. It's a book that sort of surveys 15 photographers working between art and fashion. They're mostly young photographers. And they sort of are working from London to Lagos, New York to Los Angeles. This is an image by Ewala Risku. The next image is by Stephen Tayo, working in Lagos, who identifies as a, you know, as a self-taught artist. And then, you know, you have another image here, if we can go to the next one, by Tyler Mitchell, who in, you know, lineage of Gordon Parks, right? Like, took this, wonderful image of Beyonce for Vogue in 2018, making him the first Black photographer to shoot the cover of that magazine. And then you have, if you can continue, Adrienne Raquel, who's sort of thinking more about sort of saturation, color, and sort of studio sort of portrait femininity as well. And so you have a real death of different young image makers who I was just sort of fascinated that that so many of them from different parts of the world don't know each other. We're sort of interested in these notions of desire, these notions of dress, these notions of identity, and particularly how do you construct them, right? From sort of the spaces of their communities, from the conditions in which they're working. And I absolutely knew, going back to this Gordon Parks conversation, I knew that this part of the work was not work that people in the art world would care about, right? Unless someone sort of like brought it together and said, listen, this is a frame that young Black photographers are thinking through. It's not all they're doing, because, in these, they have, diverse practices, but that's one thing that they're thinking about. And because they're thinking about it, and because so many of them are thinking about it, I think we should meditate on why they're thinking about it, right? And I think that like so often we don't do that, just as, sort of in the art world, we don't sort of think through sort of the ways in which particularly young Black artists are sort of working and why they're working that way. And I just wanted to hold space for that. And I also love fashion. I thought it was like, be a really fun thing to do, and, one of the things that's sort of been interesting, I think, in relationship to this project over the last several years is that this would have not been possible without sort of the advent of social media. And what I sort of mean by that is that we all are now taking images in various ways, right? Whether it's just us snapping something to remember it for the grocery list, or that, we're putting something on Instagram, or if we're like, using sort of social media and seeing these images to inspire us to a career, right? Or to a practice, right? And so I was just sort of interested in that. And a lot of their origin stories, unlike a lot of the photographers in this exhibition, was like, oh, I was taking photos on my iPhone, and then I thought, oh, I really like this. Let me learn about cameras. And so it was through that process, and then at some point, they might have gone to, in the case of AWOL, Cooper Union, then Yale, and then some, didn't go to school at all, or some, like in the case of Tyler Mitchell, studied film and then sort of start taking photos on the side as and so I think this notion of self-taught is complex, it's complex and it's complicated, right? And so I think that like, there's a lot to be sort of said about this project. I think that one of the things that the sort of thing I'll end with, so we can sort of talk, continue the conversation, is that, as the exhibition has been going on, I think of it as like a living exhibition. And so it's traveling now around the world. It's currently in the Middle East, I'm having Qatar, in Doha. And, at every instance, I've been able to sort of add more photographers to the exhibition. And so, which has been really, I think, I was really excited about this because it's all happening now. Like what I'm talking about, it's not like this is not a historical perspective. This is happening around the world as we sort of speak, right? New images are being made in this mode. And so I thought that it'd be really great if I could just add images as we go on. And so, the exhibition will sort of move from Doha to Arles, France, where this show originated. It's going to actually it's going to be a part of that same festival in this summer, opening in July. And we're going to add even more photographers. And we're going to have a focus on European photography, right? And what that might mean in relationship to this context. And so I think that like, it's one of those things where, these notions that are sort of presented in a very, sort of different way in this exhibition, are also present in the making of other artists. You know, one of the things, I know I said I would stop, but one last thing, when you get me going in this exhibition, I can go forever. One last thing is that I was also sort of struck by people like Dina Lawson, Carrie Mae Weems, Mickalene Thomas, Liz Arthur Johnson, folks who have, you know, have been seen purely, again, in an art context, right? And not sort of allowing for the sort of complication to also see their work in relationship to sort of like fashion, really, in relationship to what it means to sort of what self-image, right? Which is a lot of what we're talking about today, right? And so for me, it was about sort of removing some of the sort of weird like barriers, right? And saying, okay, if we're allowed Avedon and Penn and these sort of photographers to move with fluidity, then we're also going to allow Black photographers to move the same fluidity, right? And so that for me was important about this project. And we'll talk more about that, but I really wanted to give Horace time to talk about his project as well.
No, I thank you. There's so many.
There's so much. I know.
There's so much, and there's so many beautiful connections. And as I like to say, parallels of walking in concert with each other from different modes. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So Possible Selves, Queer Photo Vernaculars came when I had been at my current institution, the Williams College Museum of Art, for right about a year. And that coming to Williams coincided with the day after I graduated from Brown with my PhD, which was wonderful and lovely. But I had some work to do. You know, my dissertation was on the visual cultures of mourning and portraiture during the Civil War. And that's where my focus was. And so I come to a new place. I'm surrounded by young students. I'm surrounded by 15,000 objects that I need to learn and a history of a place that I need to learn. And when I went home at night, I'm scrolling through Instagram and I'm like, whoa, Instagram's changed in the 4 or 5 years since I first got an account and then put it off on my studies. What am I seeing? And one of the things I was seeing was what I would call this incredible galvanizing around the ideologies, the ideas, and the ontologies, the modes of being, the modes of self-fashioning around images that are encircling kind of an understanding of queerness. And what I saw was that, yes, there were still the thirst traps, and yes, there were still the felt cute, I don't know, might delete later, but there was also this sense of people going, I am positioning my body as a queer body and reaching out to form queer community through the selfie. And that felt really interesting. And what I particularly found was that this was happening with Black and brown bodies all around the world. And so as I began to talk with students about, am I seeing what you're seeing? What are we seeing? What is going on? We were circling back and forth around both kind of historic moments in the history of photography in which someone tried to quote unquote canvas the world around a thematic idea that was also an identity. And we landed to really think through, mostly in pushback, but also in deep, rigorous study around Edward Steichen's 1954-1955 Family and Man show, which was to, quote, canvas the world to encircle man's humanity to man and man's love of man. And yet that world was 146 photographers, roughly, from only about 8 different countries. And only about 7 of them would have identified as femme expressing, or female. Right? And so what Possible Selves does is to use the mode of Instagram to canvas the world, but we came up with over 500 images from 273 photographers from 22 countries, all of whom, as image makers or image posters, agreed that the idea of queer ontology and queer community making fit their positionalities. And so if we go to the next slide, and of course, in my institution, we always try to encapsulate the current moment within the collection so that that kind of brain trust of student programs, rigorous research, public feedback, and conversation and dialogue has to come into our collection holdings. They just can't stay in the contemporary. And so what we're looking at here is a beautiful grid of images by Blythe Bonin, who started one of the first femme and female identifying collectives for queer photographers in the Bay Area in the early 60s. Of course, an incredible, incredible stack by Felix Gonzalez Torres, a King Song image in the back, a Deanne Arbus, and a Catherine Opie at the leading left edge, whose birthday was a couple days ago. So happy birthday, Catherine Opie. But all to say, you had this one room, if we could go to the next image, please, where images were in broken grids, 5 different grids for all 500 photographs, differently broken up according to theme, with these gaps that in our current moment of Zoom and Google Meet just seems like someone with kind of has gone silent, but with these little gaps, just to reference for ourselves and for our viewers that no grid is complete, that grids have been these spaces that have been prescribed as neutral but have done violence to both the eyes and to the people whose bodies were forced into, whether they could quote unquote fit within that grid or not, but also to help them, we hoped, pace out their looking, and to, in that pacing, have a landing place to go, what did I assume when I looked at that body? And in what ways does that body signal quote unquote queer to me? In what ways is that body legible to me? Why or why not? Why does that matter? Why does that even care? And so the idea of someone like Jose Esteban Munoz, who thinks about queerness as a leading us to futurity, we're not there yet, but queerness helps us get there. And someone like Emily Dickinson, who thinks about queer opportunity and possibility, these were kind of the ways in which we were interrogating the contemporary mode of Instagram to get just at what you were thinking about and articulated so beautiful, Antoine, the idea of self-fashioning, image making, self-making, and the ways in which these things function beyond just the space of our own personal living rooms, but they have a lifeblood and a lifeline out there.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that is sort of in sort of thinking about Jose Munoz is I was sort of when you invoked his name, but also the sort of negative space on the wall. I think about that when he talks about the negation of the negation, right? As like, right? And so you have that blankness or that negative space, but that's always sort of what's happening with queer identity, right? You're sort of trying to negate the negative, right, to make something that's positive. And so I'm so sad I didn't get to see this exhibition.
No, but I think in the ways in which I'm so glad that the Black Vanguard is traveling, because it was always global, and it has to move global, and it has to be seen global. And the idea that you're adding, I mean, it's revelatory. It's literally revelatory curatorial practice. But the idea here was that, I really wanted, particularly for our student audience, to realize you are curating these things on your phone. Right. And Instagram now has queered its own algorithm. So now you like on something and that's what you see. But however, you are making these judgments and you are participating in these histories, whether you realize them or not. And that is neither here nor there, but by calling it out, you realize it. And by calling it out, you will never look the same at this app and these images again.
Right.
And thus, this project has to continue. This
Right.
cannot be the only academic museum who does this, because this has and is right now, this second, changing the way we look and we think about the photographic image.
Well, that's what's sort of interesting when you said that, like, you know, Instagram is querying its, you know, its algorithm based on sort of what you're telling it to do with, you know, with your likes, right? And
Yeah.
I think that sort of, there's almost like a subconscious seeing or a subconscious looking that happens, right? And I think what this exhibition does, from what you just, you know, are saying, it's to bring that sort of subconscious or unconscious to the conscious, right? And so it's, you know, it's almost like if you could, you know, it's somebody shows you something and you'll never see it, you know, you'll never not see it, right? And I think that is sort of one of the great possibilities of sort of what's possible when we sort of deconstruct images, right? It's like if someone shows you it, right, or shows you the pattern or shows you the stereotype, you'll never not see it again, right? And I think about sort of people who've done that sort of with images. Carrie Mae Weems from Here I, you know, Stood, and I, you know, that sort of, you know, seminal work, right? I think about sort of how, like, I would never look at a certain image in the same way once I've been, you know, alerted to how might a possible way of looking, right? And even that act of just saying that, you know, you can read this image multiple ways is a license to never see an image one way, right? And I think that that is just a real sort of tenet of sustained looking, right? And that, you know, I always sort of that's why, again, it's this idea of image maker, this idea of constructions, right? That sort of, it allows for the space that you sort of create here on the wall to happen in that image, right? For you to have some agency over how you see, right? And I think that is sort of what I think that's also what attracted me to sort of the New Black Vanguard and sort of these highly constructed images, right? Or even if you think about Dean Lawson, right? Her images, right? She controls everything: the dress, the movement, the position of the figure, what figure is in it, the gestures they're making, the positions they're taking, you know, all of that, right? And by the way, she's using a camera that it takes 5 minutes to take the image, right? And so there's a lot, so you have to sort of sit very still, you know, and I think about sort of, I think about, yes, those images being sort of people, but I really do think of those as sort of like self-portraits, right? Because it's so sort of, they're so deceptively normal, you know? And then when you think about sort of the process of how those images are made, you start to sort of get to sort of the constructing, right? And then you sort of get to that thing of, well, why do you want me to see this, right? Like, why do you want me to see this way, right? And layering all of those histories, and it's not just like a sort of vernacular histories, but it's like all these different histories of photography, right? You have even landscape photography in there, right? Which you don't really sort of always consider because she's in domestic spaces. But like, what do you know, like there's this image that she took, and then we can move to questions, but there's this images that she took that I just find, I write about it in New Black Vanguard, the essay, is that there's this image of Rihanna, right, for Garage that she took. And Rihanna's sort of reclining, sort of in that typical sort of art historical sort of repose that, you know, that is typical of a muse. And on the sort of in the back of the photograph, right, you have this small photograph framed as if her grandmother had done it, in this like gold, you know, sort of frame. And it's Rihanna when she's like 8 or 9, right? And there's this sort of like, just that small gesture sort of creates so much more depth in that image, right? It sort of, again, takes you back to a sort of vernacular history, right? The school picture, what, you know, a photo your mother, your grandmother, or whoever might snap of you before you run off to school, right? And it's this sort of image that they love up on, and that means so much to them for that, you know, moment of time. And so I'm just really sort of fascinated by the use of like the wall in this way in your exhibition, because I think it opens up a lot of more history, some violent and some positive.
Absolutely. I'm so thankful for that. And what I think this conversation has been able to events in my heart, in my spirit, in my brain and thinking is the importance of a kind of ethics of attention, right? And this sense that for so long, particularly in photography's modern, quote unquote, origin story between the 1839 and 1870,
Mm-hmm.
there was this frisson and it had to be, is it art, is it science, and if it is art, can it stand alone? Not yet. It must be referential to painting.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that, as you were speaking, Antoine, it just clicked in my mind is that contemporary photographic practice, particularly by BIPOC makers,
Mm-hmm.
is helping us reflect on 500 years
for sure.
of the composition construction of portraiture. And Deanna Lawson is going, I'm controlling everything here. Attend, because I am deeply attentive, rigorously attentive. But if you can get this, then you can go back to that Gordon Parks and see how he attended. Then you can go back to that John Singer Sargent and see how he attended. Then you get to go back to Cecilia Bode, to Copley. Then now we have a photographic process that is not just participating in a kind of radical poetics of the moment, and is not just participating in a kind of transatlantic history of photography, but is now in a global derivation of portrait making and process from the very moment of contact with between cultures. And that is not just powerful, it is necessary, and it is contouring, whether we know it or not, all of the ways in which we attend to culture, all of the ways in which we attend to bodies that move through space, whether that's space that we give coin to participate in, or whether it's space that even walking unconsciously is in our sensorium. And there's something so beautiful about that if we're cognizant, if we allow ourselves to attend in that way.
I know that we had questions that we were going to go through, but maybe because of the conversation has been so rich, that we just turn to, in our sort of final moments, maybe turn to some of the audience questions.
I think that's perfect, Antoine. And I just want to thank you both for this rigorous and beautiful and expansive and expanding conversation. And we have had a number of questions here in the Q&A, and for everyone still on the call, please feel free to put your question in the Q&A. We've got just a few minutes left. And I want to share this one that just came in, and it's a question asking, can you speak to how your projects have had an influence on the Black community, and what you've learned and what you're seeing in response to your work?
How about I start? I think that, you know, in some ways, it's still sort of it's still unfolding. I think that, like, you know, it's, for so many people that have reached out, they've just said that the project has been sort of a text for them to sort of return to, and whether that has been photographers, or whether that has been curators, or whether that's been photo agents or photo editors, you know, it's become sort of a resource, which I think is just amazing. But I also think that, you know, it really is a survey, you know, and I think that you could have had, you know, 16 of these books, you know, and I think that you know, I'm interested in see how the sort of the work that comes out of say doing this one book, and how, what does it, you know, maybe perhaps it inspires, you know, others to sort of think about sort of publishing and self, because there was also, I think that was also the other thing that was sort of important for me, was to highlight the fact that like frankly, these photographers didn't need me, didn't need Aperture, didn't, you know, like that's not, you know, like I'm just sort of grateful to them for their participation, because they were making their own magazines and they were making their own books, and they were making, you know, they were sort of setting up their own fashion agencies, and they were all, you know, I think there were, and media companies and media platforms and all these things. And so I think that, like, hopefully that sort of entrepreneurial spirit um, is a is an opportunity for an example for others to also do, you know. And I think that that has been the sort of thing that has at least stuck most with me, is it's affecting the community, in that it's sort of motivating others to sort of do the work that they want to sort of make, and value it themselves.
I think for me, one of the big takeaways from Possible Selves was the ways in which academic museums have always influenced their larger sister institutions. And one of the ways is thinking through acquisitions. Before Possible Selves, if an institution wanted to, say, glean or cull from social media for an image, you would use that as kind of a rights and reproductions waiver. But what we did was we actually contracted as if these things were on loan to us, which is why we cannot show those images on the grid. After they left our galleries, all of those printed images were shredded and they went off loan. And now people can go back and go to the original Earth site, Instagram, and find them. But we do not have permission to use them again. And all of those folks, for the ones that we use for promo, they were paid for their work, just like I was contracting with a professional artist studio. And that set a tone and a pace for museums going forward, to always do that for photographers' works, no matter the medium or the originating platform. And that I was really excited about. It also influenced the ways that we think about trans rights, trans identity, queer identities, not as tangential to, but centering and positioning it as critical within a liberal arts education at Williams. And both of those two things, both museologically and curricularly, were really important to me.
Thank you. We have another question that's just come in, which is asking, how can traditional museums best amplify voices that have remained unidentified or marked as amateurish? Can you recommend how to select lines that need to be drawn? And I'll just say here that I think that both of you are really encouraging, again, a very inclusive and expansive approach, and you know, leaning into complexity that is very inspiring.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only one thing that I can sort of think about is just, you know, and I think Horace just talked about this in terms of authorship, and sort of how, if, you know, like, you have a process for museums, have processes for that work really well, and it's about applying those processes in ways that are equal and equitable, right? And so if you're going to if you have to sort of loan a Picasso, you know, you should also apply that to the digital, you know, sphere, right? I think that it's about sort of treating artists equally, right? And I think through the practices of museums, you see which artists are treated, how artists are treated, and what the value are through that treatment, right? And so it's not about a reinvention of a museum. It's about, you have, you know, two sort of systems, right? That, like, where you have processes that honor and respect and treat a certain artist a certain way, then you have other processes that don't. And so it's about sort of applying that approach that has been developed and tested and tried and true to other artists. And so for Horace to say, actually, we're going to treat these digital images the same way that we might, you know, treat some, you know, painting, allows for the elevation of photography to be treated just like and respect it like a painting, right? And I think that is the, for me at least, the point, right? That there are, there are systems that work really well for a certain amount of people, right? And that, I mean, that applies across, not to sort of get political, but I always get like really sort of, it's always really funny in my mind when people like, policing is broken, and it goes, no, policing happens one way in one community and another way in another community. So we don't actually have a problem with policing. What we have a problem with is how that is applied and how we police one set of people over another sort of people, right? And so I think that like it's not. I say that to say that it's not as if the answers are unknowable. Just look at the way that we privilege certain communities. Apply those same sort of those rules and those same sort of ways of treating people to just all people. Try that, apply that to all artists, like it's not about, in most cases, it's not about reinvention. You've already sort of have the framework that works. You're just not applying it equally.
I could not agree more. I've been sitting on my hands, right? Like, and for museums that have a collection, which is my experience, so I cannot speak for those incredible institutions that go beyond art museums, that are doing incredible work with the public right here, right now, that do not have collections. But for those of us who care for collections, we have a process, sometimes a decades long, if not a centuries long process of how to quote unquote ascertain the strengths and the growth areas for a collection, both in terms of conservation, acquisitions, and a broader refinement process that may or may not include deaccessioning in some way. And we talk about that, and that is shared with our board, that is shared with various levels of trustees, that is shared with various stakeholders. You do the same thing for works by underrepresented groups. And I would also say this, every 5 years, I think every 5 years, an institution needs to do a collections priority document. And it goes through and it lists what goals did we have for ourselves that we have not achieved? Where is the money coming from to make these acquisitions? Why do we still not have a curator of XYZ? Do we need a curator of XYZ? If we have, say, works from a particular part of the world, but no curator for them, to me, that is a huge, it's not a red flag, it's a green light for deep, rigorous inquiry and possible repatriation. It's not hard. We have the processes. We have to be bold enough to follow them. And if we can't follow the processes that our institutions have given us, then you can't do bold, incredible things, because you don't have the paperwork and the language. We have to use the language and the processes we already have. It's so eye-opening to reach toward a contemporary artist to say they're not helping us fill a hole, they're helping us be transformative in support of the goals that we have always set out that we wanted to do. That's what it's about, I think.
Well, I know that we can't hear everyone who's on the call with us just clapping right now, but I want to thank you both for your bold and incredible visions, for sharing your work so generously, for bringing your thoughtfulness and care to our exhibition and speaking about your own incredible projects. Such an inspiration. I wish we had so many more hours, because it's just been, as Antoine said, such a rich conversation today, and we're so grateful to you both. I want to let everyone on the call know we will be posting this recording later. We hope you'll join us online again soon. We have a final conversation in this series. We'll be looking at the work of self-taught artist Mark Hogenkamp with author John Ronson and our own curator Valerie Russo. But for now, I hope you have wonderful afternoons, and I can't thank you enough. I hope that this is the start of many conversations between you both, because it's just electric and really wonderful to have you in discussion together.
Thank you. It was a sincere pleasure. Thank you, Persephone.